Well, time will tell.
Time will tell. So have you invested in any of these guys who are just way up there in the billions?
Well, we have, that's not not how we roll. So we basically think that 500,000 is the new 5 million, and we invested very early stage, either too early or way too early stage companies.
Yeah.
And so we haven't been as affected by the valuation environment. I mean, there's been some temptation sometimes to go upstream, but we like to stick to our game.
Yeah, great. So you talked about some of the trends that you've been focused on lately when we were preparing, but the valuations is interesting because you've got people like Ron Conway and Yuri Milner from DST coming in and actually just deciding to invest in every single Y Combinator company. And a lot, George Zachary, who I think is invested in Twitter, talking about the coming bubble, that it may not be here yet, but there's just all this indiscriminate capital that's waiting to be invested. What does that mean for someone like you, who's often seeing a lot of these early stage deals?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's funny, when I got into the venture business, I used to be an entrepreneur myself, and I believe that there's a fundamental shift happening where the entrepreneurs have all the power. And so when you look at the cost of discovering a business now, it's collapsed. And when the cost to discover business go down, the relative importance of capital goes down. And so I think if you're an investor, you have to make a fundamental bet. Is the investor in power, or is the entrepreneur in power? And so I look at what Ron's doing or what Yuri's doing or some of these other guys as things that empower entrepreneurs. And so I have to view that as a good thing.
Right.
Now, sometimes that means I'm going to be in situations where I can't invest in a company because it might be overvalued in my frame of reference of things. But in the end, I kind of feel like if entrepreneurs are empowered, we'll do okay.
Right.
As long as we stay focused on that.
I want to get to the social trends in a second. Just one last question. Also, feel free to come up with questions. This is a great time to ask the guy who's there in the early stages about some of the questions that are dear to your heart. I know there's a lot of companies, and this is why I want to just ask this one last question here, and come up to me and ask me, how do I value my company? Right? There's so much action. We're going to be talking about the social way, but it's precisely because there's so much action, so much turmoil, so much change. These guys don't know if they can value a company at $1 million or $5 million. Where are the rules? Who's setting the rules? Because there was actually this reference to collusion going on in the Valley with angels that come in together. I don't know. Were you at the table?
Well, I was
at the table,
but it was just ridiculously overblown into something that it wasn't. But yeah,
okay.
the way I look at it is the danger of talking about valuation too much is that you just forget that you're trying to build a company. And the way I look at it is, what I'm in it for is to work with people who want to build really good companies. And if you build a really good company, things just have a way of working themselves out over time. And so the first step in building a good company, apart from having a value proposition, a customer, and some of just the basic things behind a company, is to figure out what kinds of investors you want to do business with. And so, to do business with us, there's a certain range of valuations and types of deals that we do. We're not for everybody, and that's okay. But I think that the first order question is, what type of company am I going to build? Because some of these situations, people are raising money at these crazy prices. And, it's sort of like, do you remember about 15 years ago in the Olympics in the decathlon, there was Dan and Dave, and Reebok spent tons of money doing this commercial about who was going to win the decathlon. And one of the guys got DQ'd before he even got into the Olympics because he set the bar too high and he didn't pole vault over this bar. And so whenever you raise money, I always look at valuation as setting the bar in a pole vault. And if you're not careful, height, and you don't clear the bar, you get disqualified. You can't raise the next round because the base price of the prior round is too high. And so, I think that valuation is one of those things that can be a little bit of a siren song for people.
Well, again, feel free to come up with questions. We've already got one. Do you mind if we just go through these straight so we can talk about this stuff later?
Hello. Hi, my name is Carla Thompson, and I'm CEO and founder of Sharp Skirts. And I'm wondering how many women-founded startups you have in your portfolio?
Yeah, we're actually probably more than most. And so, and part of the reason for that is my partner, Amy Urico, is a woman. And so, I like to joke that we have 4 people in our firm. We have a receptionist, we have a CFO, and partner, and myself. I'm the only guy. So I guess we sort of inverted the ratio a little bit. But, you know, there are some companies we just wouldn't have found if it weren't for Ann. So for example, ModCloth, which does social commerce for dresses and outfits online. I would have never seen that in a million years. And then WordNet, Eric McKeon is the CEO, TaskRabbit, Leah, you know, actually quite a few, I think, surprisingly.
So are you seeing an increase in the number of women-founded companies approaching you lately, or is it about the same ratio as it's been?
I'm not sure. You know, I think that, so first of all, I don't necessarily look at it like I'm trying to fund more women-led companies than the next guy. I look at it like I have a competitive advantage, that most venture firms haven't really tuned in to some of the fundamental insights that could be available by having a woman partner or by, you know, investing in some female entrepreneurs. And so I'm doing it from a greedy capitalist perspective. I think that there's sort of an arbitrage, underserved market opportunity. And so I don't know if that causes more women to approach us or not. I'm not sure.
Thank you.
Hopefully it hasn't hurt us.
Lily.
Yeah, Matt Logan with VentureBeat. I'm just kind of curious. We're talking about valuations a lot. What are we in a tech bubble? Yes or no?
Oh gosh.
Sorry to put you on the spot.
Yeah. Here. Round off the years, yes, probably. Yeah. And the reason is, here's what I think is happening. I think that the venture business has rediscovered that in any given year there's about 10 to 15 companies that are truly valuable. And so what ends up happening is if a company starts to appear to be potentially one of those, there's just this huge crowding effect. You know, it's kind of like 9-year-old playing soccer, right? Everybody crowds around the ball. And so those companies end up having, you know, valuations get away from them. Now, some companies will be the next Facebook or Twitter and really be legitimately awesome in the long run. Well, hopefully those companies will. Some companies are sort of a siren song, right? It's an illusion of being great. And those companies will be overfunded and overvalued. And so if there's a bubble, it would be in that sense, in my opinion. Whereas to me, the bubble that happened in the late 90s was different. So to me, the bubble that happened in the late 90s was just mass delusion and hysteria. And I don't think we're quite there.
That's such a good point to come back to the discussion around social, right? Because you have the invention of the internet, and people like John Doerr saying it's the largest creation of wealth, invention of the internet in the history of mankind, right? And he was right. And then you had Web 2.0, which is a little blip with new Ajax technologies, and it didn't really see a lot of bubble. But now what you're seeing, and this is the question, is a social web, and isn't that what's behind this relatively strong bubble compared to the Web 2.0, which was kind of a minor little thing?
Yeah, and to me, Web 2.0 was a little bit of the beginning of the social web. So I remember going to the first Web 2.0 conference, I think it was like, 04. And the thing that I liked about what O'Reilly was saying was it was like, okay, we're all tired of hearing about recession, how everything crashed and high tech is dead. You know, let's get the party started again, right? And the idea, people called it Web 2.0, but it brought together a lot of things. And one of the important things was this idea of connecting people in new ways. And I don't think people understood it at the time, but to me, Facebook and Twitter are the social wave what Oracle and Sybase were in the client-server wave, right? They're the fundamental enabling technology that allows entire new businesses and industries to be built, for business processes to be reimagined and reinvented. And so I actually think of Web 2.0 and the social web as kind of the same thing.
Right. Yeah. So how are you approaching this? Can you talk a little bit about your thesis?
Yeah. So in the early days, and by the way, so I want to be real careful here. There were a couple of guys about 5 years ago who were just crazy enough to take my money. The first guy was Evan Williams, who started Odeo, which didn't do so well, but it morphed into Twitter. And that, fortunately, I ended up doubling down on Twitter. And then the second guy
was my question earlier. I asked if you had invested in any of these guys. So you have.
Yes, I invested in
just really early.
Yeah, and then the other was Kevin Rose at Dig. That was my second investment. And those guys, they had no reason to take my money. I had no track record as an investor. I was just some washed up enterprise software guy from Austin, Texas, who just moved to San Francisco. And if those guys hadn't said yes, we'd be nowhere to go. you know, the social web. But so once you have a couple of lucky breaks early on, you know, things start working your way, you know, get the flywheel going. So in the early days, it was all about the platforms. And you know, I was hoping that Twitter had a chance to be an important communications platform. I didn't move to California fast enough to find Facebook and LinkedIn. But in the early days, it was all about, you know, what are going to be the platforms that create network effects and have massive volume and traction. You know, we invested in a few others like Spiceworks, and, which is kind of social networking for IT. But then our strategy shifted in around 07, 08 to applications.
So when you're looking for investments, how do you, is it a mad rush when you're talking about the 9-year-olds, the soccer ball?
Yeah.
Do you have much time for theses and concepts and approaches, or is it just, you know, put your money down in with Conway and Techstars and all these guys, Y Combinator, just sucking the air out of the room in some way?
Yeah, they're good guys.
They're good, maybe because you can say that because you're one of the Power Angels who's actually luckily enough to be around that table with people already.
Power Rangers, it sounds like Power Rangers or something. I'm never quite sure what to do with that term.
Okay, so how do you differentiate yourself? So, you know, when you meet an entrepreneur, is it okay, I'm just another one of the main 5 angels, or do you have a particular approach? Right?
Well, so I have a theory about the tech industry, right? So 10,000 companies a year get funded by angels, 1,500 a year get funded by VCs. 15 of those companies are worth more than $500 million. You know, if you go from the numbers 03 to the present, and about 5 plus or minus 5 are worth more than $1 billion. And I call those companies thunder lizards, right? So I'm all about finding thunder lizards, and I think the entire business is about that. And my strategy is just to invest earlier and crazier and riskier than other guys do. And so when I talk to entrepreneurs, I'm looking to find that chemistry and that connection. You know, what I liked about Kevin Rose is he wanted to change the news business. And what I liked about Ev was she just fundamentally wanted to empower people to communicate. And so, I look for those wacky, idealistic people that sort of want to change the world, and it's probably not going to work, but if it does, it's going to be huge. And just certain entrepreneurs, they sort of go for that.
Again, feel free to ask questions. It's a great time to ask somebody who's there in the trenches with the funding process and also the thesis process. So it sounds like you're actually looking for not necessarily something that fits into a preconceived idea of where the social web is going. It's just on the raw intelligence and smarts of the individual.
Yeah, so there's really 2 factors. So first of all, the reason I like the metaphor of the wave is it's sort of like surfing. I'm not much of a surfer, but you know, it's kind of, you're behind this wave, and waves are huge, right? They have all this power behind them. And I believe investing is a lot like that. Startups are like that. If you don't find a wave, it's almost impossible to be really successful. And so part of the job of being an entrepreneur or early stage investor is to be patient enough to figure out if you found a valid gathering wave. And if you find a valid gathering wave, then you have to be a good surfer. And so my job as an investor is to pick 4 or 5 potential waves, and then go meet the very smartest people I can who are doing good work in those areas. And so I look at it as a people flow business and not a deal flow business. You know, I kind of have this faith that if I'm chasing the right waves and I'm talking to the smartest people, that the dots will just magically forward connect somehow. And they always have. And you know, the good ideas always come from surprising places. And so, yeah.
So you're talking about crazy entrepreneurs. Can you name maybe a couple of the ones that you, I don't know how much liberty you are to talk about them, but can you name a couple of investors or entrepreneurs you've betted on recently that are kind of crazy?
Well, so you know, it's funny, they seem crazy at the time and then not so much later, right? But like, I mean, I remember with Twitter for like 2 years, everybody's like, I can't believe you invested in that company, it's got no roadmap, 140 characters or less, people are tweeting that they go to the bathroom, what a rinky-dink BS company that is, right? And so, you know, for a couple of years, you know, I had to like, not be made fun of, you know, for doing that one. And then, you know, there's one that I think is very ambitious right now that I really love called WordNick, where Aaron McKeon is trying to capture all of the words in the world and all of their meanings and make them exposable via an API. And people say, well, how's that going to monetize? And I'm not really sure. But to me, it doesn't matter right now, because to me, that's like a meaningful project by an authentic entrepreneur. And when those things work, they hit it really big because they have very little competitive risk, and they have a chance to be spectacular.
In fact, that was the company that was also invested in at the same time by Roger McNamee.
Yeah.
That launched about a year ago. It was made fun of.
Yeah,
Right.
and you know, whatever, right? But you know, one of the things I've learned is that the great investments are the ones that are almost so controversial you couldn't get them done in a partnership.
Yeah.
And you know, you almost have to be at the edge of being made fun of for it to be truly groundbreaking. You have to be non-consensus and right to really make money as a tech entrepreneur.
Right. Risk. Mitch.
Mike, thank you so much. My name is Mitch. I co-founded a company called Active.com in 1997.
Sure.
And now, 2 years ago, I co-founded a company called Bump.com. And so I've seen...
The bump with the bump.
Actually, there's
No,
a
yeah.
bunch of different bumps.
We've clarified that. This is Pump Network.
Bump Network. We enable anyone to message any car through their license plate.
Okay.
But the question I have for you is, if you had your druthers and could pick your VC or your angel, what would be two things that you absolutely would avoid at all costs, and two things that you absolutely had to have, no matter what?
What would I avoid and what would I have? Let me start with what I would have, and then I'll think about what I would avoid. Well, okay, let me just step way back. In my opinion, there's two types of investors in the world. There's people who make money by manipulating cap tables, and there's people who make money by helping people create awesome, kick-ass companies. And you could just sense that vibe. And then maybe there's a third type who just likes to be in the in crowd. And you can usually sense that vibe, in my opinion, when you meet with these folks. And the people who like to manipulate the cap tables, I think, can just be poisonous because they can, you know, they take advantage of you, and they tell you you don't need to raise money, so you're almost out of money, and then they got you, you know, in a corner, and they, you know, block deals with other good VCs upstream. You know, it's just a miserable existence. You know, the folks that are good, I think, do three things well. The first is, you know, there's this saying that Clint Eastwood had in the movie, a man's got to know his limitations. And, you know, I think that a good investor gets involved without being overbearing. And, you know, they sort of have a healthy sense of their own assets and liabilities. And so they don't distract. It's so easy to distract an entrepreneur with stupid requests in board meetings. And so, you know, the good investors, in my opinion, are the ones who really are there to help, and they understand where they can and can't. And the areas where they can help, they really deliver and execute. The second thing I found is that the good investors have this sense of when to panic versus not. And so sometimes investors who haven't started companies don't really have a feel for the game, and they'll get overly concerned at things that aren't that concerning. But there will be other times when panic is the rational response, and you have to say, hey guys, you know, if we don't pivot right now, we're hosed. And so, you know, being in the foxhole with an investor who just has a good sense of that, and who, you know, doesn't panic at the pivot, and doesn't do things that are counterproductive when you have your many near-death experiences, which you will have in your startup.
Thank you.
Great. Any other questions? Got a couple minutes left. Got any, list of notes there. Is there anything we haven't focused on in terms of, I think some of you categorized the investments you've made.
Yeah, and just other ones I wish I'd made.
Oh, okay.
But you know, I guess the main thing I think about a lot these days is what are the implications of having everybody be connected socially, whether it's via Twitter, or LinkedIn, or Facebook. And I fundamentally believe that business applications are going to be sort of rethought around social computing, or the social web, or whatever you want to call it. And so, you know, like for example, one company we're involved with is called Bizarre Voice, which does user-generated content reviews alongside e-commerce products, and that accelerates transactions. And I think they'll be one of the great success stories of probably the next year. But there are several companies, you know, Groupon, Group Buying, you know, there's just all kinds of apps that are sort of taking a business process or a consumer-facing process that once existed, and they're just rethinking it around people. And, you know, I think that's the next big opportunity, is people that, you know, the companies that do that are going to be the SAPs and PeopleSofts, you know, the equivalent of what happened in client server after Oracle and Sybase. And so, you know, we're pretty excited about those types of opportunities.
Great. Anything else? We're about out of time. Michael?
Wow, this is an easy group. Usually the venture guy gets to ask all the tough questions, you know. So
isn't there anyone talking bad about angels these days? I mean, you guys are a bunch of colluders. So I mean, we talk about that. So why was it? Can you talk about what actually happened there, so we all know for the record, Because there's a lot of misinterpretation about what was actually happening there.
Well, I mean, it's one of those things. So here's my problem with talking much about it at all. Whenever investors become personalities, that's a bad sign. And so whenever the news is about investors and what dinners they went to and who they are and all that stuff, to me that's sort of like getting off track a little bit. So I just went to some dinner, and you know, I thought we were just going to shoot the bull. And you know, there's this notion that it's like, what, 75% of Silicon Valley, and I'm like, there's over $10 billion of angel investing. It's just preposterous, right? The whole thing. And you know, it's like now I can't have dinner with more than 2 angels, or it's going to be some secret nefarious collusion meeting. It's just silly.
All right, well, you heard it here.
Yeah.
Thanks, Mike, for joining us. Really appreciate it.
All right, thanks for having me.
Congratulations on the investment.